If you distill the fundamental idea of healthcare down to its purest, most unadulterated form, the essence of it just seems so simple. When someone is sick, they should get the care that they need. And this should be true for all of us humans living right now, forever on the cutting edge of the future, riding around on this blue and green orb through the universe and living our shared history as a species. But there's a heartbreaking reality to healthcare, and cancer in particular. The messy and upsetting truth is that the number of people who can get the best care, if we can even agree on what that means, which we can't, is fractional. Untold numbers of people can't even get decent care, and millions of people get absolutely no care at all. So why is that? There are glaring, enormous problems plaguing medicine and medical systems around the world. How do we unwind them? How do we even understand them? And for all the individuals in the world with cancer who are struggling, how can we bring them within reach? Can we create actionable solutions that alter the course of their disease and of their lives? It's a lofty goal, but it's the one we're going to tackle right here. I'm Evan Young, and this is Within Reach from Avalier Health. Becca Smith was 28 and life was moving fast. Youthful energy and drive would get her up and out of bed at 5 a.m. to work out and work with clients as a personal trainer. She was building a business, pouring herself and her savings into a startup yoga studio in Chester, England. She was driven. She was excited, the kind of person who would push through pain. So when her back started hurting, she did what a lot of fitness types do. She explained it away. A torn muscle or a slipped disc patched over with a heat pack or an ice pack, some PT and a chiropractor, or sometimes just a bit of grit. But the pain kept moving every day to a different part of her back. And in March 2020, Becca's body began to shut down. She woke up one morning with a crushing migraine and blurred vision. An optician saw hemorrhaging, so she went to a hospital for a battery of tests. Becca was alone in a hospital bed when two doctors came to her, closed the curtains, and told her she had lung cancer. But the news was far, far worse. It had spread down her spine. It had spread up into her brain. It was stage 4, and there was nothing they could do. Becca went home for palliative care. Friends came to say goodbye. They sat at the end of her bed crying. Some sang to her or told her stories. Some wrote her letters. If you haven't been touched this way by cancer, it's very hard to imagine. But this is the reality for so many people. One day, you're a 28-year-old fitness entrepreneur at the advent of your life. And the next, you may only have 2 weeks to live, and your loved ones are preparing for a world without you in it. But then Becca's phone rang with news. Her biopsy result was in, and her lung cancer was ALK positive. So if you're listening to this podcast, you may already understand how important this information is. And it's such a strange concept to call anything in the world of stage 4 cancer and genetic testing a lottery ticket. But indeed, that's just the metaphor we use sometimes. Now, before we continue with Becca, we have to pause. Because it's critical to understand all the different ping-pong ball combinations that needed to fall into place for Becca to get her ticket, and how so many people around the world don't get theirs and are left behind. Forget that there's a treatment that had been developed and approved for this specific cancer. Forget that the testing technology even exists, which is a marvel of modern science. These are enormous R&D barriers already cleared. Let's focus on a few other things. Becca's cancer was able to be biopsied. She was at a center with the infrastructure and the resources to take that biopsy and get it tested, and those results were turned around quickly. And it all costs money at every single turn. The financial ramifications cannot be ignored. At so many points along the way, this system, just like Becca, can get thrown devastatingly off track. With my guests today, Clare Jones, Executive Director of Global Market Access at Avalier Health, and Andrea Stevens, Precision Cancer Consortium Board Member and Interim Head of Global Commercial Precision Medicine at Johnson & Johnson, but whose opinions are hers and hers alone and do not reflect any of the opinions or policy of Johnson & Johnson. We dive deep into the extraordinary hope, but also the extraordinary challenges of precision medicine and oncology today. That's all coming up next on Within Reach. So it's been quite some time, I think, since Gleevec graced the cover of Time magazine. So as we get into the topic of precision medicine here, I really want to just first talk about our continued hopes for what it is and what it represents. So, Claire, I'd love to have you talk about this first and kick us off. And I really want to stay optimistic for a few minutes. I think if we could just break it down into two parts, though, for the benefit of our audience. First, when we talk about precision medicine, what are we talking about? When we talk about targeted therapies, what are we talking about exactly? And then second to that is, what is the true power and the promise that precision medicine holds in oncology and ultimately, of course, for patient outcomes?
Yeah, that's a big question. But I think if we look at some of the improvements in survival outcomes that we've seen over the last 20, 30 years in oncology, then a lot of that comes down to precision medicine. When we think about it, we're often talking about targeted therapies, and some of those targeted therapies will be applicable to all cancer patients with a particular cancer. Then there are also those therapies for which you have to have a biomarker test, and that test has to be positive for the therapy to have a good chance of working. So I think precision medicine is kind of all of that, but a lot of the time when we're talking about precision medicine above and beyond targeted therapies, we're talking about those therapies where you need that biomarker test to confirm that you're eligible for the treatment.
I would say that we understand more and more about the biology of disease, particularly oncology, now more than ever. And it used to be that we would give patients a few more months of life. Then with the advent of precision medicine, we're giving them years more of life and actually working towards the opportunity of a cure in some situations. And along with that, not only being able to diagnose the disease, we can also monitor the disease, which is really helping us align therapies, therapy duration, when it's an appropriate time to switch therapy. So not only giving a patient one treatment that is personalized to them, but a whole journey along the treatment pathway where we can ensure that they are getting the best treatment for them.
So in terms of the latter part of my question, when we think about the hopes for what precision medicine holds for everyone, to crystallize it, what indeed are those hopes? Is it just simply a matter of better patient survival, or is there some other kind of a hope for it?
Certainly better survival, but also fewer side effects, better quality of life, alongside that increased survival, or hopefully a cure, so that patients come off therapy and they can live their lives cancer-free without having to go for treatment regularly. I mean, I think that's what we all work for, even for those patients who sadly are diagnosed quite late when their disease is already metastatic. We do, even in that scenario, see some complete responses occasionally, and our hope is that we'll get higher and higher complete response rates and patients can come off therapy.
Okay, so if we've talked about the hopes, what are some of the issues then that may be standing in the way of targeted therapies for all at all times, if possible?
I mean, I would say precision medicines obviously are going to generally be more expensive than a systemic therapy or a standard of care that's in play today, along with, the additional cost of adding a test, which could be prohibitive in some markets. And as well as the financial piece, there's also geographic issues related to policy and literally the technical capabilities of the networks in that country to be able to deliver the treatment or provide the testing, and education and knowledge barriers. So understanding who needs to be educated on what level of knowledge every stakeholder needs. And I think one of the challenges there is, especially in oncology, everything is changing at such a fast rate. It's so difficult for a general oncologist to keep up with what's the latest biomarker for these different diseases that I'm seeing maybe 4 or 5 on a daily basis, or okay, there's this new biomarker, but I might only see one of those patients every 6 months. So how can I keep on top of how to manage that and how to identify that patient and what to do when I get that result? So there's many different barriers across the whole ecosystem that need to be addressed to be able to make precision medicine standard of care across the world.
So I think that's a great way for us to outline where to go with the discussion from here. So we mentioned cost, geography, education, and then implementation. It sounds like you might call that last category. Let's break it down. First, to talk about cost. So when you say that cost may be an issue, is it because it's a matter of inadequate coverage? Is it a matter of a cost burden to a hospital or an academic center or who have you? Is it a cost burden on the patients here? Where is cost really coming into the equation?
All of the above. There is not equity in access to precision medicines across the globe. The reimbursement pathways differ depending on the country where you live and even the area of the country where you live. And not to mention the testing, you can have an amazing drug with great clinical data that's fully reimbursed, but if you can't access the appropriate test that you need to identify the biomarker that's going to give you access to the treatment, then you're never going to be able to get that treatment. So all of the factors that I discussed earlier come into play for the drug and also for the test that's required to identify the patient for treatment.
Yeah, it's been a long-standing issue and something that a lot of us have been fighting for to try and expand access to testing. And I think we're gradually making progress, but that progress is much slower than we would all like to see. And a lot of the times there might be a process for getting coverage or reimbursement for a test, but that process isn't followed, or there's inconsistencies. They seem to kind of fall between the cracks. In practice, it's much more difficult to get a novel diagnostic test reimbursed and covered than it is for a drug, I would say, just because the processes are not as straightforward and not always followed.
And in some countries, there's going to be a large gap between the approval of the drug and reimbursement of the drug and the reimbursement of the test, which means we can have like a year gap between having the drug available and actually having the test reimbursed. And we need to find ways to fill that gap.
Speaking of gaps, there may also be a gap between the amount that is reimbursed and how much it actually costs the provider to conduct that test. There are various different steps along the way, ranging from collecting the biopsy to preparing the sample and actually running the test and then reporting the results back. So oftentimes it costs the provider a lot more to run the test than they're going to get reimbursed.
So does that lead to some hesitation on the provider part, or is there hesitation on the patient part, or both? Where does the cost really end up being the stumbling block? It sounds like maybe at the provider level.
I think it depends on the system, and I'm sure Andrea will have a view on this as well. In some countries, it will be the patient, and in other countries, it will be purely the provider.
And also the laboratory. If you're using a test kit that costs you $50 per sample to run, but you're only getting reimbursed $20 per sample to run, where's the benefit for you in bringing up that test in your laboratory? How do you ensure that you're going to get the correct payment for the coverage of the test to make it worthwhile for you to set it up in your lab? Because you're not just thinking about the cost of the test, you're thinking about the cost of the instrumentation, staffing, the computational requirements to translate the result from the analyzer into a report. If you're using digital pathology, you need to have the cost of those scanners for scanning the slides. You need to have the cost of storing all that data. So there are so many costs associated with performing the test that are not just captured in the cost of the actual kit and running it on a machine.
So at the risk of sounding a little bit naive here, I think I would have assumed the test developer and provider would provide some kind of a laboratory service for their own test. It sounds like that's not the case, though.
It can be the case. It all depends on the type of testing you're doing. So when we develop a precision medicine with a companion diagnostic, usually there's 1, 2, or 3 companion diagnostics associated with that precision medicine. But no matter how you choose your companion diagnostic, not every patient in the whole world is going to have access to that exact test. So we have to rely on other tests that are available in the market, whether they're commercially available kits, centralized tests, or laboratory developed tests that can meet the requirements to identify those patients and to match them with the appropriate treatment. And in that case, it all depends on the complexity of the test that is being used and how that is being billed and covered in the certain country. So, for example, in the US, a manufacturer can apply for a proprietary laboratory code, a PLA code, which allows them to negotiate with CMS to the cost of the test. And initially that's crosswalked to an existing test they have in their inventory. And then there are negotiations depending on the complexity of the test, whether it's DNA or RNA, whether it's a true sequencing test, whether it's single gene PCR, whether it's an IHC. All of these aspects are taken into consideration, but then you move into sort of more of the European countries where you're looking at a budget-based system where there is a certain amount of budget that's available to the healthcare system, and that is divided up between hospital and laboratories, and then within the laboratory, how much of that budget is allocated to each part of the lab, whether it's the molecular, whether it's microbiology, whether it's clinical chemistry. And once you've used the budget, you use the budget. So if you have very expensive tests in your molecular biology department, that budget's going to be used up much more quickly than it is in perhaps urinalysis.
So it sounds like along with geography and education and implementation, we can add just resource challenges to our list.
Yep, absolutely.
And they all sound incredibly intertwined with each other. I'm asking to sort of break down cost because I have a very linear and organized way that I just like to think. But it sounds like you can't really just separate cost from the rest of the issues because they're all just kind of intertwined. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's true. And also you have to think about the reimbursement environment. So in some countries, diagnostic testing is always going to be covered out of pocket by the patient. So then you have to make choices with your companion diagnostics because you're going to go with a sort of cheaper, maybe less sensitive or less specific test in a country where a patient's going to have to pay for it out of pocket compared to a more broad spectrum test with higher sensitivity and specificity in a place where there are specific coding coverage and payments set up for that type of analysis.
So it sounds like if you say to a patient, hey, there's a potential that if we could figure out with more specificity what kind of cancer you have, we might get you on a better treatment. If only you were to bear some burden of the cost here, what is the emotional and psychological impact of that on a patient if they don't have the resources themselves, they don't have the finances to cover that?
Yeah, I can only imagine it's absolutely huge. I'm very fortunate that I haven't been in that position myself or any of my close family. And also living in the UK, we're very privileged because I'm probably not even told about that opportunity if it's not going to be covered by the National Health Service. But of course, it's very different in places like the US or elsewhere, or in other markets. It's in between where the patient will have some kind of financial contribution to be made. So I guess everybody has certain expectations about the healthcare system that they have around them, and so that's part of how they're going to react to that kind of scenario. But I'm sure it's heartbreaking for patients who think there might be an option and they can't even afford the test, let alone any potential copay for the drug that might be applicable.
So I feel like you've just given us a nice segue into maybe talking about geography, since you just mentioned broad differences between us here in the U.S. We'll say U.S. and ex-U.S. as if, we're the center of the universe. Sorry about that. But to get into a little bit more detail, what are really some of those different geographical challenges that you see starting in Europe?
In Europe, there are subtle differences between the major markets, but if we go to some of the smaller European countries, then those challenges are much bigger, particularly because pharmaceutical companies might be later to launch their new targeted therapies in those markets, and therefore the tests may not have been fully set up in the laboratories in those smaller markets. The clinicians in the bigger markets, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, UK, if you're including them in the region of Europe, there are likely to have been principal investigators involved in the clinical trials in those markets. So some people in those countries will have some experience of the diagnostic, and it may have been set up for their clinical trials. In any market, there's always going to be quite a lot of work that's required to establish and get a new test up and running. And that all of that work needs to happen before the drug is launched, because it's bad enough saying, well, there might be a therapy available for you, but you're going to have to pay out of pocket or it's going to cost you to access the test. But then it's even worse to say, we can't get you the drug because we can't conduct the test in this country. So there is that variation around Europe, but we always have to remember there's a lot of countries in Europe, whether you're talking about the EU itself or geographical Europe.
There's also a lot of countries that aren't either the US or any country in Europe. I would ask also about the rest of the world. What does this look like in Africa? What does it look like in Asia, Australia? Is it markedly different, or is it just even greater a challenge in some of these places?
100% different.
Yeah.
Couldn't be more different. So, for example, in many countries in Latin America, testing may not be reimbursed at all, and it's down to the drug manufacturer to pay for the testing. Obviously, not every single patient's going to be able to be included in the budget that's been allocated for that testing. So many patients are missing out on testing and therefore appropriate treatments. And then you think about Asia Pacific, where we have many different situations, Japan and South Korea, where only the approved companion diagnostic test can be used to allocate or identify the patient for that specific drug, which is not a problem if there's only one product available for one biomarker. But if there's multiple products available for one biomarker, then you need to make sure that if you want to have access to the entire patient population for your product, then you need to be on the label of all of the available diagnostic tests, which is an extortionate investment that needs to happen to be able to essentially provide every patient with the option of having your product. And then Australia, the requirements have recently changed, but it has traditionally been very much a registered laboratory developed test environment where you identify the laboratory developed test that you want to move forward with, and then you register that with the regulatory authorities. Now it's moving a little bit more into a true companion diagnostic environment. So there's definitely not one size fits all, and we have to make sure that we have regulatory and commercial strategies that are specific to every country where we are launching a product, because if we don't do that, many patients are going to miss out on the opportunity to have the treatment that's going to be best for them.
What is really coming first? Are the therapies coming first, or are our abilities to test for them coming first?
The therapies are coming first.
Okay.
The gatekeeper in the precision medicine world, or the main stakeholder, I would say, in the precision medicine world is your HCP, your prescriber. They are the ones who are making the decision whether they're going to order the test or not. They're the ones that are going to make the decision based on the result of the test, which drug they're going to prescribe. So there's no reason for them to order a test unless they have a drug available for whatever the result of that test is going to be. Obviously, it could be a negative result and that patient may not be eligible for that drug. But our ideal world is that in oncology, a patient's tumour gets fully sequenced at the time of diagnosis, wherever they are in their disease journey. And this allows a physician to make an informed decision about not just the frontline treatment, but also the treatments that can be sequenced after that. In reality, a lot of the time, a physician already has a product in mind that they want to prescribe for that patient, and they're ordering the test that is going to identify whether that patient is eligible for that drug or not.
And is that because they're following the guidelines and they're just looking down the road at what is going to be available, strictly speaking, or are they locked into what they believe may be best for that patient? I guess, can you unwind that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, many reasons. As you said, guidelines, pathways, looking at the patient in front of them most of the time and really identifying, well, I know this patient couldn't handle this more intense therapy, so I'm going to go down this road to give them the best opportunity. Or it could be, well, what's available to me? What do I think this patient's insurance is going to cover? Which of these precision medicine products are reimbursed in our country? You know, there's so many different facets to a physician's decision. It could be they've ordered a test, but the patient's going downhill rapidly, so they need to give them a treatment today. They can't wait for the result. And that's probably going to be a treatment that doesn't need a test to be able to prescribe it, because otherwise in some countries it wouldn't be reimbursed, the treatment. So there's so many different reasons why a physician is going to make a certain decision based on the patient that's in front of them on that day.
So you had also mentioned at the start education and a little bit of a knowledge gap amongst all stakeholders. And then I think you also gave us an example of, it sounded like maybe a community oncologist that sees a particular cancer type once every 6 months, where this might even be a case for them. So is that where some of the educational gap lies? Is it just familiarity with either the disease or the available products or the available testing? Or is there a different kind of an education that it needs to exist system-wide, not just in the community onc setting, but really everywhere?
Yeah, I think there's a need for more education with all stakeholders. So that includes the patient and their family and those around them. That includes the oncologists, the people in the labs who are conducting this testing, and indeed the management level at providers as well, so that they understand where testing fits in and the importance of it too. I mean, we can focus on some specific examples, such as labs reporting the results back to the ordering physician. So there's been quite a lot of work in that area in trying to standardize reports so that if a oncologist gets a result from one lab, it looks similar to the result they get from another lab, and they don't have to go through that learning process for each lab. And even down at the level of medical students, there needs to be a lot more discussion and a lot more training. And some cases now, the curriculum at medical schools, I think, is starting to include precision medicine, because we're talking about it today in the context of oncology, but it's absolutely relevant across an increasing number of therapy areas. And as we said earlier, it is the way of the future. So it's absolutely essential that the medical students who are being trained now are fully aware and conversant with precision medicine.
So as someone who spends a lot of my professional life thinking about how information is communicated, specifically to healthcare providers, making it organized, very streamlined, give them the most important thing they need to take away, I think I'm really interested in what you just said about the way that a test result is structured for a doctor who's going to see it on the other end. So it sounds like there's not a lot of standardization there. Is that correct? It just is a little bit of a Wild West, or is there beginning to be a little bit of standardization in terms of the results and how they actually interpret those results?
There is beginning to be more standardization. AMP have just released recommendations on how next generation sequencing reports should be set up to help physicians read them more easily, identify what the biomarker is and what options are available to that patient. We definitely need to continually provide this education, though, because things change so rapidly. There's so many different test types available now as well. It's not just one biomarker. It could be a combination of biomarkers. We can include different biomarkers like microsatellite instability and tumor mutational burden. It can be combined with imaging. We can look at proteomics, multiomics. There's so many different facets in a full diagnosis for a patient, which is why the PCC is focusing on comprehensive biomarker testing to really provide the best opportunity for these patients to get the treatment that is going to work best for them.
So for the PCC, the Precision Cancer Consortium, I would love to just hear a little bit about the work you do, but specifically there, because I am curious, have they talked about how do we best provide doctors with the information that we have?
So I have worked with the PCC for 3 years. I was a member of the Access Working Group, and then for the last couple of years, I've been the co-lead of the Access Working Group. And our focus really is to find ways to ensure that patients are getting access to testing, which in turn allows them access to the precision medicines that are available in their country. We have developed value frameworks for the assessment of testing in different countries. We have various tools available on the website, like a genetic testing cost calculator that can be used to understand what the additional cost may be, but how this is going to add additional benefit of doing a broad spectrum test rather than a single gene test. And then most recently, in February, we just published the Comprehensive Genomic Profiling Guide to Implementation, which looks at all different facets of implementing comprehensive genomic profiling into a laboratory, a healthcare system, a country, a region, all the way from identifying your readiness for comprehensive genomic profiling, the strategy to implementation, the financial aspects, and how you're actually going to tactically implement the comprehensive genomic profiling wherever that's going to be needed.
It's been a real labour of love to develop it. So, as Andrea said, we've tried to move beyond what a lot of publications have done, which has been putting out recommendations about you should do this, you should do that. And this is a practical guide instead about how you develop a strategy for actually doing it and then implement that strategy. So it's tried to be very action focused and also tailoring to somebody's specific situation. So you start by answering some very quite simple questions about what stage you're at. So do you already have some biomarker testing going on and some access to NGS? And then you go from there and you look at how it's being financed currently, what data infrastructure you have in place, what training there is for staff, and you answer these questions. And then the guide, which is on the internet, will generate a report tailored to your situation for you. So it's really trying to help all stakeholders, so oncologists, pathologists, people in finance teams, and hopefully patients as well. Maybe not so directly applicable to patients, but everybody who's involved in the healthcare system, hopefully there's something in it for them.
And it's freely available and fully interactive, and you can revisit time and time again as you go along your journey, and it will create the next step for you. So it really does bring you along the journey from an understanding of what's required to a demonstration of how to implement it.
We've developed it so that hopefully there is something for everybody wherever they are in the world. So it's not specific to one particular health system. So with that, there will be some gaps where people think, well, that doesn't really work for me, or it doesn't get to the specifics of what I need to do. But that's the compromise that we've had to make it really broadly applicable globally.
So I'm interested to ask something that's a bit of a philosophical question. Is it possible for a problem to feel so big and so multidimensional that you feel a little bit crippled in attempting to attack it? And it sounds like your approach has been to develop the implementation guide that you just mentioned. But does this indeed feel like a problem that is sometimes overwhelming in its scope? And if that's the case, what is one to do from here?
I think you can hone in on specific areas, and that's hopefully what the guide allows people to do. Certainly that was the way it was written, with the full understanding that it's a massive topic. You can't possibly address every aspect of it because you just never get started. You wouldn't know where or how to start. That's the problem that the guide is addressing by saying, these are the potential challenges that you might be facing. Do you want to have some actions for all of them, or you just focus on one particular area, financing of the tests, for example? So that's what the guide allows you to do. But you're absolutely right. Otherwise, it's overwhelming. It's just too much because everything is intertwined.
Yeah, you really can choose your own adventure.
Andrea, is there a domain that the guide addresses that you really wish it didn't have to exist to address?
I think the financial piece is super important. but also that is always the biggest stumbling block. Any insight gathering we ever do, cost and reimbursement is always the biggest barrier to a lab implementing a test, a physician ordering a test, a patient receiving a test. So I think, that is probably the one that is the most frustrating, because I think, as we discussed earlier, there are still challenges all across the world, even in the most developed countries, like even in the US. Every single commercial payer policy is covering different tests in a different way, and it's not always entirely clear how. It can be quite frustrating.
Do you feel like this is an area where regulation could help a little bit?
In some cases, yes. In the US, CMS has a national coverage determination for Medicare patients with advanced cancer, saying that they can have an NGS test, but there's still limitations with that, in that it may only be once in a lifetime, depending on what you're testing for. And there's certainly opportunities, as I said earlier, for testing before a patient becomes metastatic, and they're actually looking into reopening the national coverage determination now to understand, as therapies are moving earlier and earlier in the pathway, we need to also reflect that in the testing that's available to the patients.
Are there any cancer types in which precision medicine has evolved to a great degree and where it's really just deeply interwoven to the treatments that are available? And there are any cancer types that are kind of untouched by targeted therapies?
If we take lung cancer, that's the obvious example where there's a number of different biomarkers and a number of different treatment options for each of those biomarkers if you have the positive test result. Other areas are developing. Even over the last few years, we've seen more biomarker testing required in, say, gastric cancer. And to some extent, the guidelines are keeping up. So ESMO has a whole scale, the SCAT scale of actionability for biomarker testing and for NGS in particular, I think. At the same time, you can also think there are some tumor agnostic therapies as well. So if you have a NTRK or a TRK mutation, then there are some drugs that will be applicable regardless of where that tumor is located if you test positive for one of those NTRK fusions. So it is evolving, but there are still also tumor types where you've got chemotherapy or you've got some targeted therapies that just don't need testing. For some of the antibody drug conjugates nowadays, some of them you need an immunohistochemistry test for or a different type of test for, and others will work regardless of whether the tumor is positive or negative for the biomarker. So it's a really mixed picture.
Yeah, and I would add that breast cancer and hematologic malignancies have had testing involved in the care pathway for a very, very long time, way before we, really had all these biomarkers for lung cancer. So precision medicine isn't new to oncology, most definitely, but it is rapidly expanding, and we are identifying opportunities in new tumors every day, and even beyond oncology now as well.
And that's part of the importance of testing as well, because it's critical for getting patients onto treatment, but it's also critical for expanding our knowledge and absolutely essential. It's so valuable to capture that data that can then be used to further future drug development as well. So whether it's within a clinical trial or other studies that academic centers might be using, the value of testing goes way beyond the value to an individual patient.
Absolutely, Claire. And I think that goes back to our conversation about cost versus value, because the amount of value a comprehensive genomic profiling test is bringing to that patient and also patients of the future outweighs whatever the cost of that test is.
So the value that you're speaking of is kind of a broad social value. Now, I guess the question there is all that data walled off? I mean, obviously there's patient privacy issues. Is that the case where they're just sort of collecting banks of information about all the testing that they're doing?
Again, that goes back to the country and where you live, whether the data is more readily available or not, whether laboratories or data providers are willing to sell the data, whether it is freely available in a public setting, whether it's completely walled off and nobody can get access to that data. Again, there's inequity across the planet onto how you can access the data, how the data is made available, and what you can do with that data.
And of course, it's all subject to patient consent as well.
Now, I want to make sure that we're talking about this in a solutions-oriented way, but if it sounds like you've got the pace of advancement in oncology relative to the therapeutics skyrocketing, right? I think we're just moving along really quickly, but it sounds like the world that you're in is by definition a little bit reactionary to that, because it's like, okay, this has just been advanced. It's a new product for a new target in a different cancer type in which maybe we haven't had something before. Great. Now we have to figure out how we test for it and implement that test, and now it's covered. I mean, is that accurate? Is there always going to be that balance between research and then putting it in the hands of people that need it?
When you're talking about launching drugs, there has to be a reason for a physician to order a test, and there has to be an actionable result from that test. And many times in my role, I'm very much in favor of trying to utilize a test that already exists, or that physician is already familiar with, or a methodology they're familiar with, or adding a gene onto a panel they already order, rather than trying to be innovative and differentiating on the testing. Because once you get into clinical practice, it's a much heavier lift to introduce something brand new and do all the things that we've already talked about to get that available to a patient, rather than identifying what can fit in to clinical practice today that is going to not be such a huge stretch for all of our stakeholders to embrace. Whether it's from a test cost perspective, a technology perspective, a education perspective, all of these different aspects, it's going to be a much smoother ride if you understand your stakeholders, where they are today, what they're doing today, and how you can make sure that the new testing paradigm you're introducing, or the testing paradigm you're introducing, fits in rather than requires a lot of different things to happen to make it work.
That's really interesting. If you could wave the magic wand, what are the one or two or even three things that you feel like we could put into play to get more patients on therapies that are really going to be tailored or appropriate to their cancer types?
I think for me, it would be the ability to have that test done really at first diagnosis. So you don't know what you don't know until you look for it. And I'm not a clinician, I'm a molecular biologist by training, but I just know that if that data was collected, I'm sure we could advance even faster than we are now, and patients would benefit as a result. With the number of therapies that are available in some tumor types now, it makes such a difference to the treatment journey and the physician sequencing choices, and informs the prognosis as well. So that's what I'd like to see, that comprehensive testing being done at first diagnosis.
Absolutely. And also for our stakeholders to have the perspective of, I want to get a full picture of this patient and their tumour before I even start to think about what treatment to give them, rather than starting with a treatment in mind and already limiting the testing they're doing to be able to fit that treatment option.
So then as far as the low-hanging fruit goes, I mean, is there anything that seems really simple that we could be doing right now that we're just not for whatever reason?
I think getting recognition of the fact that although a next generation sequencing panel, be it 20 genes or 300 genes, is more cost efficient than single gene testing. And that's been demonstrated time and time again in various different markets. Yet we still have single gene testing being ordered, which in the long run means patients have to wait longer for treatment decisions to be made. We're not giving a full picture of their disease, and they're missing out on opportunities to have the treatment that's going to best serve them.
So is that an education gap? I mean, we're just not getting the word out effectively enough.
I think it's many different things. It's an education gap. It's also the way the value of testing is being assessed in different markets. It's generating the appropriate data and packaging it in a way that it's going to be recognized by the appropriate reimbursement decision makers. It's ensuring that physicians are always up to speed on what the current status is for a patient with as far as insurance goes, what their specific insurance covers and doesn't cover, and having one voice to those reimbursement decision makers or payers to say, this is in the guidelines. You need to cover to guidelines. And that's not even happening today.
I would absolutely agree with Andrea. And I think also in the age of AI, there needs to be more consideration of what AI can do. We're understandably cautious, and there have been some studies looking at how it can be used to help with identifying patients that are suitable for enrollment into clinical trials, matching patients with trials.
Definitely agree. So many opportunities to use AI in clinical practice to address those practice gaps where we are losing patients along the diagnostic pathway before they even get to their first treatment choice.
So I really appreciate just the extraordinary amount of expertise and I think passion that you both have for this. It's such a hard topic to understand. So I want to make sure that I'm not missing something here. I mean, is there any burning question or any part of this as a topic, broadly speaking, that I haven't asked or I haven't covered that you think would really be important to talk about?
I would say the PCC's focus is moving towards comprehensive biomarker testing beyond just comprehensive genomic profiling, which can incorporate different testing methods as well as imaging, tissue, protein expression, spatial biology, multiomics, proteomics, as well as comprehensive genomic profiling into whole genome sequencing, into minimal residual disease testing. And I think the challenge now is going to be not can we do all of these different things for this patient, but how do we get all of this information into one place to make it easily accessible and digestible for our clinicians to be able to make an informed decision. So even in the most sophisticated electronic medical record systems, there's still 4 or 5 different types. So everything has to be done at the hospital level. There's no catch-all. There's no one-size-fits-all. Even today, getting your NGS tests incorporated into those electronic medical records in the same way across the board. Some hospitals, even in the US, are still using fax machines. And you have administrative staff entering results into the electronic medical record, all the way through to the results go directly from the laboratory's LIMS system into the EMR without a problem. So there's many different ways for these test results to be incorporated. But until even that is standardized, getting all of these other testing methodologies and results together to make an informed decision on one single patient is going to be a big challenge.
I feel like I read a few years ago here in the US that AOL just disconnected its very last dial-up internet connection in the country, which, I don't know if that's true or not, but it sounds like what you're talking about. I mean, It's just, there's such a wild differentiation between what one office may be doing versus what another office may be doing.
Yeah.
Okay. So then, Claire, how do you feel like we can close this out? Where does this leave us kind of pointed toward the future?
Oh, there's so much to look forward to, starting with following what's coming out at the conferences and in publications. But it's, I think, deciding what you're really interested in and then honing in on that, finding the best sources of information and people to talk to. That's key. People having conversations with each other and connecting, because I think, as we said earlier, nobody's going to be able to solve this by themselves. It is about making those connections.
The future is patients living longer and better lives, because that's where science is going.
And hopefully that future is accelerating as well, as we've seen recently with some of the breakthroughs, whether they're from immunotherapy or other types of approaches to treatment.
Andrea, how about you? And I'm not even going to say, let's think 5 years into the future, because I think that that's maybe a little too close, but let's go like 10 or 20 years into, let's say 20 years into the future, for maybe about as long as it's been, right, since I initially sort of opened talking about Gleevec. Where do you think we are in 20 years?
I think, as I said earlier, we're moving away from giving patients a few extra months of life through to years of life to actually moving towards a cure, and patients getting diagnosed and treated much earlier in their disease, giving us opportunity to control and obliterate that disease before it takes hold, giving them the chance to live longer and better lives.
Amazing. Claire and Andrea, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So let's pick Becca's life back up again. She started taking an ALK-targeted therapy, 8 tablets a day, and her cancer started shrinking. She didn't just get 2 more weeks to live, she got 6 more years and counting. She teaches Pilates, she walks, she drinks coffee with those friends, the ones whose letters she kept. She has a Labradoodle named Ralph. Becca went to Bali on a yoga retreat, and on a beach there, her partner Sammy proposed. And she got married a month before this recording. Becca is the embodiment of the promise of precision medicine. The shift from, there's nothing we can do, like those doctors told her when they closed the curtain, to, there's a treatment for your specific type of cancer. So tell me, does everyone with cancer deserve this or not? Thank you for joining me on Within Reach, a podcast hosted by me, Evan Young, and produced by Avalier Health with the help of Podcast Labs. For more Within Reach content, including in-depth reports about cutting-edge topics in oncology, patient stories, articles, and more, visit withinreach.avalierhealth.com. You'll also be able to meet our SenseMaker experts who have worked hard to bring Within Reach to life. To get in touch, email us at withinreach@avalierhealth.com or follow us on LinkedIn. And who is Avalier Health? Avalier Health is a global strategic partner for the healthcare industry, working across the breadth of the product lifecycle to ensure every patient is identified, treated, supported, and cared for equally. Our advisory, medical, and marketing teams come together powerfully and intentionally to forge unconventional connections, building a future where healthcare is not a barrier and no patient is left behind. If you'd like to support Within Reach, please leave a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Your input helps us make the podcast even better, points us to topics that are relevant to you, and helps us reach new listeners. All you have to do is open up the podcast app on your phone, look for Within Reach, scroll down until you see it, write a review, and tell us what you think. Join me next time as we continue to uncover issues in oncology and work toward their solutions here on Within Reach from Avalier Health.